What are the main types of farming used worldwide? How does each farming technique work? What are the pros and cons of each type? What impact does the farming technique have on the quality of the product? Who controls the practice of organic farming? When did each of these originate? How is our food raised? If you want to know the answers to all of these questions, follow me along in my presentation about livestock farming. To begin, there are two main types of farming: arable and livestock ranching. Arable farming is the growing of crops for consumption, and livestock ranching is the raising of domestic animals to obtain their produce. I'll be concentrating my presentation on livestock ranching, and I'll be dividing it into four different types, which are not standardized. However, in each of these different types, there are specific factors which make them fall into that category of farming. So, there's intensive farming, extensive farming, semi-intensive farming, and organic farming. All of these types of farming have the aim of raising domestic animals to obtain their produce, and often this produce is eggs, milk, and meat. The livestock most commonly used are cattle, sheep, poultry, fish, pigs, and goats. However, I'll be focusing mainly on mammals, for example, cattle and pigs, and then poultry. So, to begin with, intensive factory farming. Intensive factory farming is the rearing of animals in confined indoor spaces all year round, 24/7, meaning that there are extremely large amounts of animals kept in large barns or cages in the case of poultry, and these animals never have access to nature and are fed grain, and on the whole are kept indoors 24/7. To give you an idea of the scale of these types of farms, in the EU, 40,000 chickens, a farm with 40,000 chickens and 2,000 pigs would be considered intensive. Now those numbers are absolutely huge, and that's the minimum. So you can imagine how large these farms are. Their popularity, well, in the USA, 99% of all farm animals are kept in intensive farms, and in the UK, 70% of all farm animals are kept intensively. Background of this farming technique: it first arose in the 1960s, and it was designed by scientists. It was designed as a response to the increasing world population, as farmers needed a way of producing maximum yield from minimum amount of land possible, so as to minimize the amount of land used whilst also feeding the whole world population. So what are the pros and cons of this farming technique? To start off with, it's very easily automated, as it is often done indoors or essentially in big barns, and this in turn means that there is less labour, or more specifically manpower, so physical labour done on the farmer's behalf. Also, of course, there is less land needed, which is essentially the aim of this farming technique. And however, even though it is done on very little land, there's an extremely high yield. This farming technique also focuses on the fact of having maximum profits, as it raises extremely large amounts of animals, and even though each product is sold rather cheaply compared to other farming techniques, the sheer scale of this farming technique means that farmers are able to maximize the amount of profit that they make. There are large amounts of yields from these farms all year round, as the conditions in which the animals are kept can be controlled very easily. For example, poultry are kept in cages, which helps the farmers control and increase this rate at which they grow, or the amount of eggs at which they lay, and also depending on the amount of feed the farmer decides to give, often as much as possible, the animal will grow as quick as possible or produce as much milk or eggs as is possible for that animal. The cons of this technique is that it is extremely heavily reliant on exterior factors, meaning that it is not self-sustainable. For example, it relies on huge inputs from exterior feed companies who grow grain to feed the livestock, as they do not make use of natural forages. Antibiotics are used, especially in poultry farming, to reduce or to deal with the stress that the animals go through living in such tight conditions, and to produce the food and the grain needed to feed all this livestock. The chemicals sprayed onto the plants need to be imported and hence make the farm less self-sustainable. Animal welfare is often a major concern, as the high stocking density means there's lots of stress in the animals and often fear, and on the whole it's not very nice conditions for the animals to be living in, and this is often questioned by many people. This technique is also highly damaging and has negative environmental impact, as it produces very concentrated amounts of manure and antibiotics in that manure and chemicals to produce the feed. All of these different substances are released into waterways or into the air, and can in turn have negative effects on the surrounding environment. These conditions also increase the likelihood of zoonotic diseases by encouraging parasites, as the animals never move, and the animals also have very close proximity with each other, meaning that it's an extremely hospitable environment for parasites to grow. Zoonotic diseases, for anyone who does not know, are diseases which can pass very easily between humans and animals, which makes intensive farming slightly more dangerous for the farmer, as if these diseases are more present, then the farmer is much more likely to get ill. This system also requires a high amount of capital and labour to be inputted specifically into these farms, as that's the only way in which farmers are able to increase the yield to the most possible. However, this capital and this amount of labour is often offset by the density and the size of these farms, as they are able to produce huge amounts of products in short periods of time and not very much space. So these two factors are often offset. On to the next farming technique, extensive farming. Extensive farming is, as you can see from the name, the opposite of intensive farming. It works with the idea of low productivity per surface area, and this means that it is done on a much larger scale with a much lower stocking density, so that each animal has much more space to roam, and it makes use of pastures and grazing, meaning that the animals make use of the natural forage to obtain most of their diet. Nowadays, sheep are often used in these systems, as they are one of the easiest animals to maintain in these conditions. And this farming technique requires much smaller inputs compared to the amount of land used, in comparison with intensive farming, which uses a much smaller plot of land. However, it has huge amounts of inputs. There are three main types of extensive farming, which are nomadic herding, ranching, and shifting cultivation. I will not go into much detail. However, shifting cultivation is the process of slash and burn, where farmers burn and cut down forests to create pasture for their livestock, and then move on, continuing with this slashing and burning of forests. And nomadic herding is an extreme example of extensive farming. However, it was mostly used in the past, as it is an extremely harsh way of life for any farmer, as the farmer must move around with their flock, looking to maximize the amount of pasture the animals have access to. What is the background of this, the history of this type of farming? Well, this type of farming is much older than intensive farming, and it began in the year 1000 CE in Spain and Portugal, where large numbers of animals were starting to be raised for commercial consumption, and these animals were raised extensively on pastures. It was later brought to America by the first Spanish settlers who brought their cattle there, and this then became transformed into ranches and became the foundings for cowboys who raised cattle for beef in the plains in America. And the pros and cons of this method. The pros are that this method requires much less labour to land unit, which basically means that there's a much lower stocking density for the animals in these conditions, and there's much less labour in any certain land area compared to intensive farms, as extensive farms work with a much more land. Another advantage is that the welfare of the animals is much higher, and it's not a concern, as animals are living an extremely natural way of life in these conditions and are much happier, which also means that there's less use of antibiotics. There is a much lower chance of parasite spreading and disease spreading in these conditions, as animals are always moving and not as close proximity with each other, and this is a less hospitable environment for parasites to thrive upon, so they are less prone to picking up these parasites and getting diseases. This method also has a smaller environmental impact, as there's not much use of antibiotics. The manure produced by these animals is much less concentrated, as there is a lower stocking density, and it's overall a much more natural way of raising animals, so it has less of a negative impact on the environment. What are the disadvantages? First of all, there's much more land is needed, and this is the reason why intensive farming was created, as extensive farming could not feed the world because too much land would be needed to raise enough animals to feed the world. This also means that these farms need to be situated in areas which are very lowly populated, so that there's lots of land which can be grown with grass to graze these animals. However, this then means that the product must travel further distances to reach consumers, which usually live in highly populated areas, and this in turn adds a cost to the final product, which overall is much more expensive than intensively raised products. This is also caused by a higher quality in the final product, as the animals have had a more nutritious diet. Another disadvantage is that often the yields are much lower from these types of farming, as much more land is required, meaning less animals can be raised, and also there are much slower returns in the case of meat animals, as the conditions are less controlled and they grow at a more natural speed. Okay, now on to semi-intensive farming systems. Semi-intensive is a non-defined technique, and it has no specific definition. However, it is often used on many different scales, and Agri for Profit states that it's commonly used by small-scale producers and are characterised by having one or more pens in which the birds can forage on natural vegetation and insects to supplement the feed supplies. From this short definition, we can see that the animals raised in these systems do have access to a certain amount of grain supplied by the farmer. However, they also have access to natural forages, and they're kept in various different pens. So not like extensive systems, slightly more intensive in the sense that the animals don't have as much space. However, they are moved and kept in a more natural way than intensive systems. There are different types of semi-intensive farming. There's shepherd grazing, there's grazing in fenced paddocks, as in the image in the bottom right corner, and scavenging. In the image in the bottom right corner, you can see that there are the sheep or the goat in the background, and a new pasture in front, full of new grass. And then back here, it illustrates where there would be a shed when needed. So the animals can be housed at times and also released into pastures to forage naturally at other times. If you have not understood already, this is a combination of extensive and intensive farming, meaning that the animals are at times allowed to graze. However, they are housed when the conditions aren't appropriate for them to be outdoors, unlike in extensive farming. The background of this farming and the history, it's this type of farming is, as it is a non-standardized system, in the past it was often used for subsistence farming, families who grew their own food. And however, the history of the exact dates when it was created and by who is slightly unclear, as it is found in the origins of farming. The pros and the cons of this type of farming. The pros. First of all, this type of farming is much less expensive than an intensive system, as startup costs are much lower, the feed costs are much lower, as the animals are able to make use of natural forages, and this is why it is often the first choice for small-scale producers. Less space is required than in extensive systems, so it can be done on a smaller plot of land, as the animals can be housed if needed and when necessary. Livestock welfare is also better, as the animals live a more natural style than intensive systems, and this also in turn means that in certain situations these animals are less disease prone than intensively farmed animals, because there is a lower stocking density, and the animals, as we said before, are moved from paddock to paddock, leaving the parasites behind. This system can also be less polluting than an intensive method, if done correctly, as the feed cost, the pollution from creation of the growing of the feed, and the manure is lessened due to the smaller number of animals and the smaller amount of feed needed. The disadvantages of this system is that improper management can cause a build-up of parasites in outdoor pens, as if animals are left in them too long. The same can happen as in intensive systems, meaning that parasites start to build up and travel from one animal to the next, spreading disease. And also, if kept in one pen too long, it can also cause damage to the environment, ruining the soil beneath the pastures, and manure at that point can then start to build up and pollute waterways. This system is also very labour intensive, which is why it's often not a choice of big scale producers, as if animals have to be moved from large sheds to pastures every day, or from paddock to paddock. This can be quite labour intensive for the farmer itself. Okay, so now on to the last type of farming, organic farming. Organic farming has four main goals. First of all, it is to produce high animal welfare, to maintain high animal welfare in their farms, meaning that the animals are as happy as possible and content in their environment. Also, the products produced by these systems need to be as high quality as possible, and this is done via the limited use of medical drugs and the most natural way of life possible. Limited use of medical drugs is an idea created on the basis that animals which are allowed to express natural behaviour and live a more natural lifestyle should be in less need of medical support from the farmer and should have a stronger immune system to fight off disease by themselves and should also be less prone to disease. Limited use of medical drugs also causes less residues of these antibiotics and drugs in the final product, which in turn increases the quality of these products. Another point is that organic feed is obligatory. The use of organic feed is obligatory in these farms as it improves the health of the animal, and that is one of the goals of this farming system. So what's the background of this farming technique? It was developed by Sir Albert Howard in the 1900s, and he got the idea from traditional Indian practices which he believed to be more natural and more sustainable. So he decided to bring these ideas back to modern societies as he believed it would help farming in these societies, help it improve, and also help the consumer's health improve. When Rachel Carson's book was published in the 1960s, it was a huge help at increasing public demand for organic produce, and also recently concerns regarding GMO and pesticides have gradually increased, meaning that the demand for organic products which do not use any GMO or pesticides has increased. Next, the pros and cons of this farming technique. So the pros of this farming technique are that it benefits consumer health, as the products produced by this in this system have a much higher mineral content than in intensively farmed systems or other systems, as the animals have access to top quality feeds when they are being fed grain and top quality pastures and most natural feeds possible, which obviously contain more nutrition than feeds fed to intensively raised animals. The aim of this is to raise the extremely healthy animal, and so that their produce will then be as healthy as possible. The products produced by this system are also residue free, meaning that there are no chemicals or antibiotic traces left in the products, so that they are less harmful to the consumer. In New South Wales, in Australia, there was an experiment, a survey taken, which stated that there was a 50% increase in 32 years of cancer cases in New South Wales. Meg Howe states that this increase may be related to exposure to toxic chemicals, and this exposure to toxic chemicals relates directly to farming and the chemicals used in farming. So the aim of organic farming is to reduce these toxic chemicals that humans are exposed to and the residues in feeds to create a more healthy environment for humans to live in and hence reduce cancer cases. This also leads on to me saying that it is an environmentally friendly practice with low feed inputs, and when there are feed inputs, they are always organic, meaning that they are sustainably grown. In the disadvantages, in the short term, they are less productive, these farms. However, since intensive farms are not sustainable, it is impossible that they continue to thrive in the decades to come. So in the long term, organic farms are more sustainable and hence more productive. However, in the short term, they are less productive. Another disadvantage is that they are less easily automated, as they make use of natural environments, so they often can be more labour intensive on the farmer's behalf. So who regulates organic farming? There is a council regulation, which is 834/2007, which was a regulation deciding all the restrictions for organic farming, and it was decided by the EU, the European Union, in 2007. They were a set of rules, a set of standards to which any farm must comply to get the organic certificate and be able to label their products certified organic. Every specific country in the European Union has a specific certifying agency which goes around farms and takes analyses of how the farm works to then give the farm the certificate or not. The farm receives a certificate if it complies with all the regulations were set by the EU. There are certain associations in the different European countries which are meant for teaching farms about how to be organic and what to do to get the certificate. And in Italy, this association is called l'Associazione Italiana per l'Agricoltura Biologica, also known as AIAB, and its job is to teach farmers how to produce organic food. Where are the most organic farms? So here we have a graph of the top 10 countries with the largest area of organic agricultural land. As we can see, in first place there's Australia, which has about 35 million hectares of organic land. This may be due to the fact that it has an extremely large agricultural surface area, meaning that a higher percentage of this would be organic compared to other countries. However, in second place there's Argentina, and then there's China, Spain, United States of America, Italy, Uruguay, India, France, and Germany. So you can see that most organic land is spread in slightly more developed countries, however, not completely. Next, I will speak about intensification and how it occurs. Intensification is the process of which extensive farms become intensive, or any farm becomes intensive. And there have been tests which show that this process of intensification occurs most rapidly in Southeast Asia. This is shown by the fact that extensive poultry farms in Malaysia, Japan, and South Korea, which are in Southeast Asia, are less than 5%, so there aren't many extensive farms. And in Bangladesh, Cambodia, India, Nepal, and Myanmar, there are 75 to 90% extensive poultry farms. This shows that there are many fewer intensive farms in the latter countries. Intensification is a result of and causes an increase in GDP per capita. This statement was stated by the following website, and this website also states that the USD, or the GDP per capita, can be used to predict when intensification will occur in a certain country. And there's a rather interesting connection between the US GDP per capita and the intensification of a country. So this website states that specific numbers can be created to predict when intensification will occur. For example, intensification occurs for poultry when the USD per capita is between 1,000 and 10,000. So below 1,000, most farms are extensive, and above 10,000 USD per capita, most farms are intensive. And the same applies for pigs. When the USD per capita is between 1,000 and 30,000, that's when the intensification occurs, usually for pig farms. What effects does intensive agriculture have on us, the consumers? First of all, there are the residues. Residues are what's left of chemicals and antibiotics when they are in the products which are consumed by the consumers. And in intensive agriculture, there have been traces of atrazine and glyphosate, which are chemicals which can, when consumed via the residues in products, can negatively affect the functioning of the endocrine system of the consumer. Also, the residues from antibiotics used in intensive farms can create a certain antibiotic resistance in humans, meaning that antibiotics taken by these humans later on may be less effectful, have less effect on the human, on the person. Nitrates, when there's an excess of nitrates, which can be caused by fertilizers or manure, concentrated manure, in waterways, this excess can contaminate these waterways and contaminate future drinking water, which in the past has caused blue baby syndrome, which is a syndrome which affects mostly infants. The fumes from nitrogen-rich substances, when they combine with combustion emissions, can also cause disease and death among humans. So this is an effect from intensive agriculture, as they release lots of fumes from the concentrated manure. And also products from intensively farmed animals have been tested to be lacking certain nutrients. For example, proteins, phosphorus, iron, riboflavin, vitamin C. These different nutrients have been much decreased in intensive agriculture because of selective breeding and the low levels of nutrients which the animals have access to via their grain that they are fed. Organic agriculture has the goal of fixing and finding a solution to all of these problems so as to help humans be as healthy as possible and live a happiest life possible. Thank you for listening. That's the end of my PowerPoint.